Hello and welcome to this impactful lecture from Professor Lourdes Vera. My name is Kate Huber and it's my honor and privilege to introduce this talk to you tonight. Professor Vera is an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology and the Department of Environment and Sustainability at the University of Buffalo. Professor Vera has years of experience participating in community-based environmental justice initiatives as both scholar and activist. Her work to repair relations through community-based actions gives an overview of what environmental justice looks like. We hope that it will inspire new ideas for how we can bring these environmental justice practices to the Netherlands. Environmental justice addresses the uneven distribution of the benefits and burdens of extraction economies. That means that certain communities and neighborhoods experience more pollution than others. Environmental justice research has found that environmental burdens disproportionately affect marginalized communities, often based on race, class, gender, and citizenship or documentation status. Environmental justice studies in Europe lag behind those in the USA. There are different reasons for this, but one reason is that the kind of demographic data often used to identify issues of environmental racism, for example, is not collected in many parts of Europe as a result of the Holocaust. Yet, as Dutch municipalities like Bonaire start to bring official complaints against the Dutch government for unevenly mitigating the impacts of climate change on Dutch coastlines, the need for environmental justice work in the Netherlands comes into sharp relief. As an environmental sociologist and civic scientist, Professor Vera's work can offer us insights here in Tilburg about how to carry out environmental justice initiatives. Professor Vera has worked with communities living near oil and gas development to monitor their air for contaminants. She also serves on the coordinating committee of the Environmental Data and Governance Initiative, envisioning and building digital tools and research infrastructures for environmental justice data. Professor Vera's interdisciplinary work spans environmental science, social science, and critical theory with articles appearing in Atmospheric Environment, Engaging Science, Technology and Society, and Mobilization. The resources and examples Professor Vera offers in the talk you are about to hear open up questions about science, justice, data, and the future. Professor Vera's talk leaves us much to think about as we collectively work towards more enduring and environmentally just futures.
And when Michiel asked me what to emphasize during his introduction, I said, please tell them that I love Buffalo. I am from Buffalo. I was born and raised here, but my father was born in Puerto Rico. We have quite a strong Puerto Rican community here on the Lower West Side that also has a high rate of asthma. And there are in Buffalo high rates of breast cancer as well and multiple sclerosis. So these and developmental disabilities like ADHD, which is also what I have too. My aunt has MS, and I have friends who have been diagnosed and beat breast cancer. So these are illnesses for ADHD disability that many people in Buffalo have, and they have been linked to environmental health, environmental pollution. And this is very common in this area of the United States, a very, post-industrial, deindustrialized area that used to be a center of manufacturing. And, throughout the 70s and 80s, as manufacturing was outsourced globally, the economy disintegrated, and you see that this train station here, the Buffalo Central Terminal, it's monstrous and a beautiful building. It used to be an epicenter of transportation here in Buffalo, and it was built on the fringes of the city when the builders thought that the city would continue growing, but it stopped and now it sits abandoned. We are having the population in Buffalo grew for the first time in 70 years these past couple of years, but we are still much smaller than we were. And so we're dealing with this legacy of pollution. Another, I'm going to be referring to this website a couple of times in this talk. It's called the Global Atlas of Environmental Justice. And it's really interesting to look at. I tell my students to look at this when they're thinking about a research topic for their final projects, because there are so many potential places here to research. And we're also, so here's Buffalo, and we're also near Niagara Falls and Love Canal, a dump site that was in the 1970s a major influence in environmental policy and governance, where families in a mostly, so this isn't quite an environmental justice story because it was a mostly white middle-class neighborhood organized around a dump site that a school had been built on, and there were many children who were getting sick, and that happened about a 30-minute drive north of where I grew up. So living with these realities and this legacy has really influenced my desire to address environmental injustices. So the root of these injustices, I'm going to argue, is the history of colonialism that has constructed the Anthropocene. And I'm sure most folks have heard about the Anthropocene, and it's still an unofficial geologic epoch that is characterized by an understanding that humans are the major driver of environmental and biogeochemical change. And this has been critiqued, but what's really interesting is this past summer, I was browsing Twitter and I saw this tweet from an environmental science professor at University of Maryland that said he was resigning from the Anthropocene working group. And this working group is part of the International Union of Geological Sciences. And these are the people who are working on officially designating the Anthropocene as a geologic epoch or geological epoch. And so he resigned because there was a disagreement over the line at which the Anthropocene would be said to begin. He disagrees with this line in the 1950s, which is, right when I showed you that picture of the Buffalo Central Terminal, that's when Buffalo was booming and growing. But he says that dividing Earth's human transformation into two parts, pre and post 1950, does real damage by denying the deeper history and the ultimate causes of Earth's unfolding social environmental crisis. Are the planetary changes wrought by industrial and colonial nations before 1950 not significant enough to transform the planet? And when I read this as a social scientist, I was pretty alarmed that people aren't quite understanding the impact of colonialism on the construction of environmental injustice and environmental harms. And I couldn't believe that these geologists weren't getting it. And I was totally on board with Earl Ellis. But then I realized I'm in my bubble of social scientists who study this, and that there are that it's important still to talk about the construction of environmental injustice and root it in colonization and the slave trade. So this is where I'm going to move on to do. These are pictures here of, this is a popular illustration around by activists fighting for environmental justice. And then here's a facility that was recently shut down and demolished in Buffalo, or outside of Buffalo, that was polluting the area. So these are some examples of environmental injustice in the region. And but I'm going to talk about how colonization and the slave trade, then settler colonialism, redlining and segregation are all processes that have led to this. So beginning in 1492, and this is personal for me as well, yeah, as someone with Puerto Rican ancestry whose ancestors were affected by this and committed this. So I have ancestry from, Africa, from the indigenous Taino people, who we see Columbus greeting in this engraving of him arriving at Hispaniola, which is now Dominican Republic and Haiti. And then we see the statue of him that still stands in Viejo San Juan, Puerto Rico, and Old San Juan. And then the Dutch West India Company, that was a major player in kidnapping slaves from West Africa and selling them as as commodities to the colonizers in the Caribbean islands. And starting with Columbus, quote, discovering America, which is what we're taught in our textbooks here as kids. Beginning with this, this jump-started a whole centuries of colonization and slave trade, and which shifted throughout but persisted throughout the centuries, and also shaped the environment, the flora, the fauna, and the way that we relate to land, and also the way that land is organized and what is built. So through this colonization, especially in the United States, we have settler colonialism, which is more, I explain it to my students of, a form of slow violence. It's people coming and settling on the land, just like some of my ancestors and me right now on this land in the Haudenosaunee territory in Western New York. And it wasn't, but that isn't to say it wasn't violent, incredibly violent, that settlers in the 19th century went out and hunted Native Americans to kill, and also broke the relationship between Native Americans and the buffalo, which is an animal that tribes relied on for sustenance, for clothing, for food, and it was central to indigenous culture. So what settlers used to do in the 19th century was, as trains were being built, they would even shoot buffalo from trains just to kill them, because it was an indirect way of killing indigenous peoples, of committing genocide. And you see over here that there's a pile of buffalo skins in Kansas City that had been hunted by settlers. Then the government took land from indigenous people that were pushed off, and then sold it to settlers. And through this process, you see, as sociologist David Pellow writes, that this co-extermination of indigenous peoples in the buffalo is a reminder and example of intersecting oppressions, revealing the deep and disturbing links between genocide and ecocide. So killing the buffalo and Native Americans, these acts were very much interlinked, and these relationships were broken. And so continuing this act of arranging the land, rearranging it, turning it into, parcels of property, and selling those parcels, we're fast forwarding to the mid 20th century, and this is continued through capitalism and governance in forms of redlining. And this is one major example in Buffalo. There are going to be many Buffalo connections here. That banking company, so homeowner mortgage company, that is selling land in 1937. So this map is from 1937. They actually categorized the neighborhoods. So there's this pattern of, mapping has always been a colonial tool. And then categorizing and simplifying the land as well. And then keeping people in these categories and in these spatial categories. So we have green, which means first grade. It's the top grade of a neighborhood. And the mortgage lenders and real estate brokers, they classified these green areas as upper middle class white neighborhoods that were desirable and quote, ethnically homogenous, where people wanted to live. And then the blue is, quote, still desirable, generally or nearly or completely white US born neighborhoods and sound investments. C, the yellow, is characterized as declining, which means that immigrants from Europe were there. Mostly they were Jewish, Italian, Irish immigrants during this time. And then D, red, hazardous. This is, quote, infiltrated and with undesirable populations, such as Jewish, Asian, Mexican, and Black families. And then these areas are more likely to be close to industrial areas and have older housing. And so this is what the neighborhoods were like then. And then this is what they are like now. I mean, so the parcels aren't going to align exactly, but what I wanted to show you, and this is information from, so here in the US, our Environmental Protection Agency has a mapping tool where you can look at your area and you can see your neighborhoods and understand the health disparities in terms of life expectancy, heart disease, and asthma, which are linked to environmental harm. And I chose asthma. But so over here, you see this corresponds to this area that was yellow. And the asthma rates are very high. And it's also still very much, this is the neighborhood I live in. It's a very diverse and immigrant neighborhood. And then this neighborhood over here that used to be red and yellow and is now red for asthma is mostly Black and African American. And then the gray areas, which have lower asthma rates, those are very similar, those are corresponding to the blue and green areas are mostly white up here. So we can see that there is a direct link between redlining, which is, this practice of mapping out the neighborhood and selling property to certain people in certain areas, and then environmental injustice, which is what is produced. And so we have, and now we have highways that are cutting through these neighborhoods, but not through, the mostly white neighborhoods. And that's really a root to environmental injustice. And so taking a step back, when I think about this and when I learned about this, I really thought about the role of division and the disjuncture in relationships. And some scholars are starting to write about this quite a bit. So, and there are multiple levels to this, but these are some parts that I thought that were, I stuck out to me. One is government agencies, and scholars Timothy Neal and Kristen Howie write about this concept of divisible governance. So government agencies, through this history of colonialism and which perpetuates environmental injustice, have also formed in ways that divide the environment, dividing land, water, air, and therefore the relationships between them. So for example, in the United States, we have the Clean Water Act, which is all regulations about water. We have the Clean Air Act, all regulations about air. And we have the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, which is all about solid waste. So these regulations and this form of governance separates the environment and land, water, and air. They, in reality, all relate to one another, or it's part of these broader cycles and processes, but the regulations divide them. And there's even more to say about that. Also, regulations divide molecules. So I'm going to bring up PFAS in a bit, but this is one example of I don't know if folks have heard of PFAS and forever. They're nicknamed forever chemicals here. They're per and polyfluorinated alkyl substances. So they're the chemicals that are in Teflon. They were produced by DuPont, the company DuPont and 3M, and they were originally used to coat Army tanks in the US to protect them from the elements. So these are a class of chemicals, a class of molecules which means that there are thousands of these types of compounds, which then means that because our regulatory system, the way it's organized, it only regulates one molecule, so one pollutant, and then another pollutant, and then another, instead of groups of them. So in order to regulate thousands of these types of compounds, it would take, we don't have enough time on this earth for that. So that makes it pretty impossible. So then, and you can, as you can tell, I could probably talk a lot more about that as well. James Scott, the historian James Scott, has written about the state and legibility, how forests have been built and organized for study in a simplified way, and that through this process, nature eventually became a natural resource, right? So again, we have just, it's key to colonialism is the conversion of natural of nature into a resource, into a commodity. And then we have histories of war and oppression. And then these divisions especially are produced by histories of colonialism. And we see, you know, in the current war in occupied Palestine, that it's, you know, I did a lot of reading and tracing the history of Israel and Palestine and its rootedness in British colonialism, the rootedness of this conflict in British colonialism. And that's very key to these histories, is the pitting of historically oppressed groups against each other and production of conflict. And then disconnecting people from land. These are the barrels that were at Love Canal that I talked about earlier. And then as all of this is happening, climate change discourse, it's often a larger scale that is talked about, right? It's, for example, cap and trade, the trading of credits in order for one facility to pollute to release greenhouse gas emissions, but then what's taken out of that conversation is what's happening to the community next door. And so given these histories, I'm going to talk about environmental justice today. And I come from a lens of reparative justice. And I took this image from reparationsforslavery.com, which explains a lot of this history of slavery as well, and argues that reparations are due for slavery. And as I explained, slavery and the slave trade, which was part of colonialism, is really at the root of environmental injustice. And you see that environment, you know, is one piece of the pie. And I would say land and housing is also part of environment. You can say everything's part of environment. But some after effects of this history, you know, has been codification in laws, disinvestment infrastructure, you know, which comes from redlining, unequal access to resources, displacement, lynching and violence, and erasure of this history. And in response, I want to think about justice as reparative. And this is a quote from the New England Board of Higher Education, that reparative justice centers those who have been harmed and focuses on repairing past harms, stopping present harm and preventing the reproduction of harm. And so in doing that, or trying to do that, there's so many forms of injustice to focus on that all intersect and relate to one another. But environmental justice specifically, it's really in the United States interlinked with racial justice. And the movement was catalyzed in the 1980s when a community of color in Warren County, North Carolina, which is in the southern part of the United States, it was mostly Black women laid down in front of tractors that were going to begin building a toxic landfill in their community. And so this really jump-started the movement. And laying down in front of a tractor is an incredible example of direct action. And it was effective. And so I just also, in expanding on the definition of environmental justice, or discussing it, this is text from Energy Justice Network. And they describe the difference between environmental equity and environmental justice, and their stance is that we don't want people to be poisoned, period. I think we do need to come to the understanding that there is no going back. Chemicals like PFAS, they're in 99% of living beings' bodies, and they're not going away. So that's maybe a topic that we can talk about during discussion. But how can we stop? And that's the question. And then it's a response to the environmental racism, which is the disproportionate impact of environmental hazards on people of color, and then also on other marginalized groups. And so this definition right here is critical of the state. It's critical of the government that pushes definitions of equity and has been seen, has a track record of failing at this and not really sufficiently including community voices. And so I was thinking about the connections between Tilburg and Buffalo and other sort of deindustrialized or post-industrial places in the US, and kept exploring this EJ Atlas. And so we can see here some current environmental issues in the area, and this atlas is not complete, clearly. So I wonder if there are, if there's issues that you can think of closer to where you live in your area. And but we have over here close by PFAS pollution by Chemours/DuPont, and DuPont is also, DuPont's all over all over the globe. So thinking about these companies as a modern form of colonialism that now has altered the land through the manufacturing and release of PFAS substances. Oh, and also just to add some information about PFAS is that they cause cancer, they're carcinogenic, and they affect reproductive systems as well, and accumulate into the food chain and human bodies. So this website, again, is really great for seeing issues close to your area, and then finding out more about them and more about the groups that are organizing. And we have a DuPont facility. I think it's been closed in our area as well. So that's one connection. So I'm going to, let's see. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about my personal responses as a scholar to these issues. During my PhD program, I read Black Feminist Thought by Patricia Hill Collins, a sociologist, and it really shifted how I approach my work in these histories moving forward, and emphasizing the importance that knowledge plays in empowering oppressed people. She writes that one distinguishing feature of Afrocentric feminism or Black feminism is its insistence that both the changed consciousness of individuals and social transformation of political and economic institutions constitute essential ingredients for social change. So one thing that sticks out here is the repairing of relations, building relations, and knowing that we as individuals are part of a broader social whole. And now we're going to get very specific. This is the network that I'm part of, the Environmental Data and Governance Initiative. And this picture was taken at University of Toronto in Canada, but we mostly focus on US governance and politics. But from this, thinking more broadly about the role of knowledge and environmental knowledge in activism. So right now, we're mostly academics and technologists. We have more than 50 active members, and most are volunteers. And we are working towards the environmental right to know, to hold governing agencies accountable, but also critique government and governance as well, promote transparent, collaborative, community-centered governance, and then model democratic values in our own organization and work. For instance, we don't have an executive director. We make decisions collectively and try our best to not create hierarchies within the organization, which is difficult, but we really put a lot of work towards creating protocols and structures to do that. And generally, we have been advocating for better data and information policy. So again, data is transformed into information, which builds knowledge about these issues, like how industry during COVID, pretty much President Trump, or former President Trump, signed an executive order saying that industry didn't have to report any of the pollutants that they were emitting into the air for a set number of months during the COVID pandemic. And so our question was, okay, then how many violations weren't reported? And how much information then, what kind of information gaps does this produce? And what does this mean for public knowledge and understanding? And we also found that the Trump administration took away a lot of information about climate change from websites. But moving beyond documenting these harms, we want to think, how can we build technologies and systems for making knowledge that is more equitable and just? and that is more grounded in community needs. And that's why my major focus is around environmental data justice. And that's the public accessibility and continuity of environmental data and research supported by networked open source data infrastructure that can be modified, adapted, and supported by local communities. So it's a convergence of data justice, which emphasizes open information, transparency, but also open information, but taking into account the harms of surveillance and the need for privacy. So that's why we say it could be modified, adapted, and supported by local communities, because that kind of context matters, that kind of place, who is affected, where people are located, and the histories of those places and that land really matter when it comes to how information is created and how we think about and study our environment. Okay, I forgot this was animated. That's exciting. So I started thinking about environmental data justice with do-it-yourself air monitoring that I was conducting early in my PhD program, thinking about how to report this information to communities, back to communities. And this air monitoring around oil and gas facilities, I know I'm going through a lot of different kinds of pollution, a lot of different toxicants, but as I said, my work has always been very all over the place and interdisciplinary. So there's a lot here. But I think the main point is that it's important to monitor the air, to study the environment with people. And I worked in a community that had already said, hey, we want to monitor the air, not going into a community and monitoring the air for them, but actually designing studies with people. And we found that a pollutant called black carbon was a huge issue in the area. And then during this time, I also was working with environmental data justice and doing this theoretical work and then building digital tools for analysis of the government data. So over these years, it's working at different scales that has been important to me. So remember when I mentioned climate change and how discourses focusing on climate change at a huge scale can often leave out the local scale. So for me, working across these levels and connecting them, right? Creating the relationships, reinforcing relations across scales is very important. And then these are results from some air monitoring, the air monitoring in Texas that I did. I'm not going to go too in depth, but we found that in the summer, the wind was coming from the facility. So the home is where the family lives is in the middle of this chart. I made it somewhat confidential to hide their location. So you could see I blurred out these street numbers. And then, but I kept the image of the facility to show that. So this is where the wind is coming from when we saw high levels of this pollutant. And in the summer, when the wind came from that direction, the levels were a lot higher, and we could pair a spike in those levels with photographs that the family took of the flare, which burns off excess oil and gas that's right in their backyard. And then in the winter, it wasn't so high because the wind was mostly coming from the other direction. But there were still moments where there were there was a lot of flaring going on that was likely the source of this pollutant black carbon, which is what you see in the tubes here. And it's what comes from wildfire smoke and diesel combustion as well. So it's very bad for your lungs. And it's very important here to combine stories and consider stories as data with the quantitative data as well, and not just take one form of knowledge, not just present quantitative evidence and take that as face value. It's very important to contextualize so that different kinds of data contextualize one another, and that we uphold the stories of communities who are experiencing these harms and making them part of the scientific story as well. And finally, I'm going to end with the concept of mutual aid and moving even more at a hyperlocal scale and thinking about repairing relations. Robin Wall Kimmerer, who is an indigenous ecologist, wrote in Braiding Sweetgrass of mutual, well, this is my interpretation of mutual aid. And she writes that we make a grave error if we try to separate individual well-being from the health of the whole. The gift of abundance from pecans is also a gift to themselves. By sating squirrels and people, the trees are ensuring their own survival. The genes that translate to massed fruiting flow on evolutionary currents into the next generations, while those that lack the ability to participate will be eaten and reach an evolutionary dead end. Just so, people who know how to read the land for nuts and carry them home to safety will survive the February blizzards and pass on that behavior to their progeny, not by genetic transmission, but by cultural practice. So she's talking about the relationships between us as humans and the land and animals, plants, and each other as cultural practice and relating across, building relationships across these things as part of culture. And in Buffalo, what I'm also involved in really is building a culture of mutual aid. And mutual aid involves responses to these bigger problems, such as food injustice, food inequity, through, for instance, so this is my house, and in front of my house, I have put out a community fridge, and there's a lot of immigrants in my neighborhood, especially people who have been displaced by the severed relations from colonial histories, such as, war and climate change, have come to Buffalo. Someone told me I have to fact check this, but my department chair told me that I think 30% of political refugees have ended up in Buffalo. And Buffalo is also a city it's been listed as a top city for climate refuge. And already a lot of, like, my neighborhood is so many languages and cultures and countries represented. So we have a lot of poverty. And then one way to address food waste as well as poverty is a mutual aid where anyone can leave food and take food. And then there's also a mutual aid project called Food Not Bombs, where I'm not part of it, but I know people who are, and they get together and cook food that would otherwise be wasted and distribute it to the community. And then there is the Buffalo Snow Brigade that happens every year, where people sign up and shovel the snow in front of homes of the elderly and physically disabled who would otherwise might be shut in their homes when it's there's a lot of snow. And so these are, community practices. This is outside of institutions. We're not a nonprofit organization. We're a network of community refrigerators that are trying to build relationships and promote justice at the micro scale. And so in conclusion, I have a picture here from the Papahanaumokuakea National Monument of coral reefs that are sacred to the tribe located on this island, that's part of the Hawaii Islands. And they are at risk of being they're at risk, like most ocean life, from climate change, and currently being studied. And then I have a picture of an event about the access to environmental data for Latinx and Spanish-speaking communities. And I think making these connections moving past just documenting damage towards building alternative ways of making knowledge and working with data is a way that and Eve Tuck's words, she's a professor at University of Toronto in Women and Gender Studies department. She's an Indigenous Studies scholar, and moving past damage-centered research towards desire-based frameworks, organizing locally, and then as I've taken you through this presentation, coming to understand how relationships have been broken, but also how we can repair them during this Anthropocene epoch. So thank you very much. Here's my email, lavera@buffalo.edu, if you have any questions. And I'm looking forward to hearing your responses and questions.